Welcome to Autumn Nights in Cedar Hollow, a gentle escape into a world where time slows and the night hums with quiet peace. Nestled deep within a golden valley, the little cottage by the creek glows softly against the twilight, its hearth crackling with warmth. Here, the whisper of cedar trees and the murmuring water weave together like a lullaby, carrying every worry away into the stillness of the night. As you settle in, let the calm rhythm of the creek and the soft glow of the fire guide you toward rest, where dreams drift as gently as falling autumn leaves. The first cool winds of autumn swept through Cedar Hollow like an old friend returning home, brushing through the amber leaves and stirring the scent of pine, apples, and wood smoke. The town sat nestled between gentle hills and forests that glowed like embers in the fading sunlight. As the days shortened and twilight came early, lanterns began to flicker in windows, one by one, as if the town itself were exhaling into a soft, content sigh. Down a narrow lane, hidden behind a curtain of red and gold trees, stood a small cottage wrapped in ivy and the perfume of fallen leaves. Its chimney puffed a thin thread of smoke that twisted upward into the crisp evening air. This was where the story began. On an autumn night quiet enough to hear the hush of the forest, yet alive with the promise of warmth, memory, and a touch of magic. Eleanor had come to Cedar Hollow seeking silence. After years of city noise and restless nights, she found herself yearning for something she couldn't quite name. Something older, slower, deeper. She rented the little ivy-wrapped cottage at the edge of the woods, where the nearest neighbors were a half-mile away, and the only sounds after dusk were the hoot of an owl and the slow trickle of the nearby creek. The moment she arrived, she felt something different in the air, a peace that seemed to settle into her bones. The wind through the trees sounded like whispers of an old lullaby, and the air carried a faint sweetness, as though the world itself were readying for a long, cozy sleep. The evenings became her favorite part of each day. She would light a fire in the stone hearth and sit wrapped in a thick wool blanket, a mug of spiced tea cradled between her hands. The flames danced and cast long, golden shadows across the walls, moving softly like memories come to visit. Sometimes she would read, but more often she would simply listen to the crackle of the fire, the sigh of the wind, the faint rustle of leaves beyond her window. It was a symphony of quiet moments, each one folding gently into the next. Outside, Cedar Hollow lived by its own rhythm. The townsfolk moved unhurriedly, their days marked by the turning of leaves and the scent of baked bread drifting from the general store. There was the sound of laughter from the town square on market days, the ringing of the old church bell at dusk, and the occasional passing of an old carriage along the cobblestone road. But by nightfall, the town seemed to fall into a shared dream, a hush so complete that even time seemed to slow its pace. Eleanor would walk the winding path behind her cottage, where the forest thickened and the moonlight pooled on the mossy ground. Each night felt slightly different. Some nights were clear, with stars like pinpricks of silver light scattered across the velvet sky. Other nights, mist would drift through the trees, softening the world into shades of gray and gold. She often thought that if she listened carefully enough, she could almost hear the forest breathing, the deep, slow rhythm of the earth settling into rest. One evening, as the sky deepened into indigo and the scent of rain hung in the air, Eleanor followed the path further than usual. The forest floor was damp and soft beneath her boots, the air cool but not cold. Somewhere ahead, she heard the faint sound of water trickling, a small stream weaving its way between the roots of ancient oaks. She followed it until she came upon a clearing she hadn't seen before. In the center stood a wooden bench, weathered by time but still sturdy. Beside it, an old lantern hung from a low branch, its glass fogged with age. She hesitated for a moment before sitting down. The lantern flickered faintly, though no one was there to light it. The light grew warmer, steadier, casting a golden glow across the clearing. The stream shimmered like silver ribbon under the moonlight. It was so peaceful that Eleanor felt her breath slow, her thoughts grow quiet. In that stillness, she felt as if the forest itself was welcoming her, wrapping her in a kind of wordless comfort. As nights passed, she found herself returning to the clearing often. Each time, the lantern would glow softly upon her arrival. Sometimes she would bring a book and read aloud, her voice carried gently by the wind. Other times, she would simply sit and watch the way the moonlight rippled across the stream. It became a ritual of sorts, a communion between her and the night. One particularly chilly evening, the wind carried the scent of smoke and cinnamon. From somewhere in the distance came the faint sound of laughter, drifting like music. Curious, Eleanor followed the sound down a path she hadn't noticed before. The trees parted to reveal a small gathering by a bonfire. A few townsfolk sat wrapped in blankets, sharing stories, their faces bathed in the glow of firelight. They welcomed her with warm smiles and a mother cider. The conversation was gentle, flowing like a slow river, full of memories of old winters and legends of the forest. Someone strummed the guitar softly, and another hummed along, a melody simple and soothing, as old as the hills. The fire crackled, sending sparks spiraling upward into the night. Eleanor leaned back and looked up at the stars, feeling an ache she hadn't realized she'd been carrying slowly ease. The warmth of the fire, the kindness of strangers, the hush of the woods, all of it blended into a perfect stillness. When she returned to her cottage later that night, the world felt quieter still, as though the earth itself were tucking her in. She lit a candle, opened her window, and let the cool night air fill the room. The sound of crickets was soft and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of the world. She lay beneath her quilt, the firelight dimming beside her, and drifted into dreams filled with golden leaves and quiet streams. Days turned to weeks, and the season deepened. The air grew crisper, and frost began to lace the edges of the windows each morning. The trees, once bright with color, began to shed their final leaves, letting them fall in slow, spiraling dances to the ground. The townsfolk spoke of the first snow that would soon come, and the market filled with candles, wool scarves, and jars of honey. Each evening, Eleanor walked to her lantern-lit clearing, where the light still greeted her like an old friend. Sometimes she imagined the lantern as a remnant of something ancient, the spirit of the forest, perhaps keeping watch over the quiet heart of Cedar Hollow. There was comfort in that thought, in the idea that some lights never truly went out, even when the nights grew long. As winter's breath began to touch the hollow, the air took on a crystalline stillness. The creek's surface shimmered with the first signs of ice, and the world seemed to pause between one heartbeat and the next. On her final night before the snow, Eleanor sat at the clearing once more. The lantern's glow was stronger than ever, wrapping the clearing in a cocoon of warmth. She whispered a quiet thank you to the forest, to the stillness, to the peace she had found here. When she finally rose and walked back toward her cottage, she noticed how the trees swayed gently as though in farewell. The night sky above was vast and infinite, filled with stars that shimmered like scattered embers. She knew she would carry this quiet with her always, the hush of the woods, the warmth of the fire, the peace of autumn nights in Cedar Hollow. And as she slipped into bed, the last thing she heard before drifting into sleep was the faint whisper of the wind outside her window, murmuring like an old friend. Rest now. You are home. The next morning dawned slow and soft, with a golden mist curling over the trees, and a hush so complete that even the birds seemed reluctant to disturb it. Eleanor woke to the gentle creak of the cottage timbers expanding in the warmth of the early light. Her quilt, woven with autumnal tones of russet and gold, was warm against her skin. She lay there for a moment, listening to the faint crackle of embers still alive in the hearth, the occasional whisper of wind teasing the edges of the window pane. She rose, wrapping herself in a robe and padding barefoot across the cool wooden floor. When she opened the door, a gust of crisp morning air greeted her, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The world was utterly still. Dew clung to the last of the fallen leaves, and the sun filtered through the forest canopy in beams that painted the mist gold. There was a magic in mornings like these, mornings that seemed to exist between time, when the world hadn't quite woken and everything felt possible. Eleanor made tea, as she always did, steeping chamomile and cinnamon in her old ceramic pot. She took her cup outside to the porch and watched as a fox trotted quietly along the edge of the woods, its fur glowing amber in the dawnlight. She smiled softly, as if greeting an old neighbor. Everything here felt alive, yet unhurried, each small moment unfolding with its own quiet rhythm. Later, she walked into the town square. The cobblestone streets glistened faintly from the night's rain, and the bakery windows were fogged from the warmth inside. Mrs. Claiborne, who ran the bakery, greeted her with a cheerful smile and offered her a cinnamon scone fresh from the oven. The air smelled of sugar and spice, and soft jazz played from a small radio on the counter. Getting used to the quiet, Mrs. Claiborne asked as she wrapped the pastry. "I think the quiet is getting used to me," Eleanor said with a laugh. The older woman chuckled knowingly. Cedar Hollow has a way of doing that. It listens before it speaks. Those words lingered in Eleanor's mind as she made her way back through the lanes, the scone warm in her hands. The town truly did feel alive in ways that words couldn't quite explain. Every gust of wind, every rustle in the leaves, every flicker of candlelight in a window, it all felt like part of one great, breathing rhythm. That afternoon, the clouds rolled in thick and gray, and by evening, the first drops of rain began to fall. Eleanor lit her fire early, the flames spreading warmth through the small cottage. The rain tapped softly on the roof, a sound so soothing it seemed almost like a lullaby. She curled up by the hearth, her book open but unread, her gaze drawn to the dance of light and shadow. When the rain grew heavier, she decided to walk to the clearing. She pulled on her boots and coat, took her lantern, and stepped into the misty night. The world was hushed but alive, the smell of wet earth rich and sweet, the sound of raindrops whispering through the trees. When she reached the clearing, the old lantern hanging from the branch was already lit, glowing through the rain as if waiting for her. She sat on the bench, her cloak damp but her spirit at ease. The sound of the rain mingled with the murmur of the creek, a music older than memory. She thought of all the people who might have sat there before her. Wanderers, dreamers, those seeking rest or healing. Perhaps the lantern had guided them too, as it guided her now. The light seemed to pulse softly, and for a moment, Eleanor closed her eyes and let herself simply be. No thoughts, no worries, just the rhythm of rain and the warmth of light. The next few nights followed their own rhythm of rain and firelight. The townsfolk, too, seemed to settle deeper into the season's calm. The market was filled with laughter and the scent of roasted chestnuts. Children carried paper lanterns shaped like pumpkins, their giggles echoing through the fog. Evenings were spent in soft gatherings, neighbors sharing soup, telling quiet stories of old Cedar Hollow legends. Eleanor listened, fascinated by tales of the forest spirits said to guide travelers home, of the whispering creek that changed its song depending on who listened. One story told of a woman who came to the hollow a century ago, heartbroken and lost, and who found peace beside the same creek Eleanor loved. The locals said the lantern had been lit in her memory and had burned every autumn since. That night, Eleanor returned to the clearing again, drawn by a feeling she couldn't name. The forest was silvered with moonlight, the mist low and soft. The lantern burned brighter than ever. She sat quietly, thinking of that woman from the legend, how she too might have come seeking rest. The night deepened, and Eleanor's thoughts drifted like the mist itself. She thought about her life before Cedar Hollow, the crowded streets, the noise, the endless rush of days. It felt so far away now, as if it belonged to someone else. Here, time didn't press. It unfolded gently, moment by moment. One night, as she sat by the fire, she began to write. At first, just small notes, a thought, a memory, a fragment of feeling. But soon the words began to flow, unhurried yet steady, like the stream behind her cottage. She wrote about the forest, the lantern, the faces of the kind townsfolk, and the peace that had taken root in her heart. Writing became another ritual, another layer of calm woven into her days. As autumn waned, the air grew sharper, and frost began to sparkle in the mornings. The forest turned quiet, preparing for winter's hush. One morning, Eleanor woke to find the world blanketed in snow. It was a light dusting, but enough to make everything shimmer like glass. She stepped outside, her breath misting in the air, and listened to the profound silence that followed the snowfall, a silence so deep it felt sacred. That evening, she walked once more to her clearing. The lantern still burned, steady and warm. The snow glowed faintly under its light, and the creek hummed softly beneath a thin crust of ice. She sat there a long while, her hands tucked in her coat, her heart full of gratitude. The cold didn't touch her. There was too much warmth in the quiet beauty around her. In that stillness, she realized what she had been searching for wasn't silence, but belonging, the kind of belonging that doesn't need words or noise, only presence. She belonged to the rhythm of this place, to the whispers of the forest, to the dance of the firelight in her cottage, to the soft sigh of wind over the hills. And as she walked home beneath a sky heavy with snow, she knew Cedar Hollow would always be with her. Every time she closed her eyes, she would hear the creek, smell the pine, and feel the gentle pulse of that golden lantern waiting in the woods. That night, the fire in her hearth burned low, and she drifted to sleep with a smile. Outside, the snow continued to fall in lazy spirals, the world wrapped in silver dreams. The forest watched over her, the lantern's glow faintly visible in the distance, a promise that peace, once found, never truly leaves. That night, as the snow deepened outside and the fire in her hearth whispered low, Eleanor dreamed of the creek. In her dream, the water glowed with a soft, golden light, winding through the forest like a living thread of warmth. Fireflies hovered above it in slow, shimmering patterns, and the air was heavy with the scent of pine and smoke. She walked along its edge barefoot, her steps leaving no prints in the snow, and the lantern that had hung from the tree in the clearing floated before her, leading the way. When she woke, the morning light filtered pale and silver through her curtains. The world outside her window had transformed overnight. Snow blanketed the trees and roof lines, muffling all sound. She rose quietly, pulling on a sweater and wool socks, then went to the window. The forest glimmered in stillness. It was as if Cedar Hollow had slipped into a dream of its own, resting under a soft white quilt. Eleanor made her tea and sat by the fire, her thoughts drifting back to the dream. There had been a strange comfort in it, a sense of being led towards something familiar and gentle, something waiting patiently for her to understand. She smiled at the thought, letting her eyes close for a moment, listening to the soft pop and sigh of the firewood. Later that day, she decided to visit the small bookstore in town, an old stone building tucked between a tailor shop and a cafe that always smelled of roasted coffee beans. The bell above the door chimed softly as she entered, and warm air wrapped around her like a blanket. The scent of old paper and ink was immediately calming. Behind the counter sat Mr. Hollis, the elderly owner, with spectacles perched on the end of his nose and a tabby cat asleep on a pile of ledgers. "Ah, Miss Eleanor," he said, smiling. "You've brought the snow with you." "I seem to have that effect lately," she replied with a small laugh. He chuckled and gestured toward the shelves. "Take your time. The books will find you when they're ready." Eleanor loved that about Mr. Hollis, how he treated every book as though it were alive, capable of choosing its reader. She wandered through the aisles, running her fingers along the worn spines, pausing occasionally to read a title or trace a name in faded gold lettering. Near the back of the shop, she found a small table stacked with journals bound in soft leather. One caught her attention. It was dark green with an embossed image of a tree whose roots intertwined with the shape of a river. She opened it and smiled. The pages were blank, waiting. "I'll take this one," she said softly. Mr. Hollis nodded knowingly. "Good choice. That one's been waiting a while." Back at her cottage, Eleanor set the journal on the table near the fire. That evening, as the snow continued to fall, she began to write again. Not about her past, but about what she was living now. She wrote about Cedar Hollow, about Mrs. Claiborne's laughter, the fox in the morning mist, the sound of the rain on the roof, and the mysterious comfort of the lantern in the woods. The words came easily, flowing like the creek. As the days passed, the snow deepened. The town slowed even more, and life took on the rhythm of winter's patience. Neighbors helped one another clear paths, shared loaves of bread, and gathered for quiet evenings by the fire. Eleanor was often invited to join, her presence now woven into the easy fabric of the community. She found herself laughing more freely, speaking more softly, feeling less like a visitor and more like someone who had always belonged. One evening, she walked again to the clearing. The path was nearly hidden beneath the snow, and the forest around her glowed faintly under a sky full of stars. The lantern was still there, burning steady and golden. The snow around it sparkled as if dusted with tiny diamonds. She sat down on the bench, her breath rising in soft clouds, and gazed at the light. For the first time, she spoke to it, not aloud, but within as if to an old friend. "Thank you," she thought, "for waiting." The lantern flickered, just once, in a way that felt almost like acknowledgement. A wave of warmth spread through her chest. She stayed there for a long time, the world hushed, the stars bright, until her eyes grew heavy. When she finally stood to leave, the path home seemed to shimmer faintly with light, guiding her steps. That night, she dreamed again of the creek, but this time, she wasn't walking alone. Beside her was a figure, indistinct yet familiar, their presence calm and kind. They walked together in silence, the lantern floating ahead of them, until they reached the clearing where it hung. The figure turned to her and nodded, a gesture of quiet understanding, before fading into the light. Eleanor woke with tears in her eyes, though she wasn't sad. It felt like something inside her had gently shifted, something that had long been waiting to rest. She sat up and watched the first light of dawn spill across the snow, feeling a peace that was both new and deeply familiar. Weeks passed, and winter began to soften at the edges. The snow melted slowly, revealing the damp earth beneath, and the first hints of green returned to the forest. The creek grew lively again, rushing with melted snow, its song brighter, fuller. One afternoon, Eleanor took her journal outside and sat by the bank, writing as the water sparkled in the sun. She wrote about stillness, about patience, about the small, beautiful moments that make up a life when one learns to listen. When she closed the journal, she looked up to see Mrs. Claiborne walking along the path, waving a mitten hand. "We're having tea at the cafe, dear. Come join us." Eleanor smiled and rose. The sound of laughter carried on the wind, and the scent of fresh bread drifted through the air. The world had thawed, and she felt herself thawing too. That evening, the fire burned low once again, and Eleanor sat watching the last embers fade into a soft glow. Outside, the creek murmured its endless lullaby. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, about the light that had waited patiently in the woods for her to arrive. It seemed to her that peace wasn't something one found, but something that found you when you were quiet enough to listen. As night deepened, she curled beneath her quilt, her eyes growing heavy. The wind brushed softly against the windows, and the moonlight spilled in gentle silver across the floor. Somewhere far off, perhaps only in memory, she could almost hear the faint hum of the lantern still burning at the edge of the forest, its golden glow keeping watch over Willow Creek and every heart that had ever come there seeking rest. Eleanor's breathing slowed, her body sinking into the warmth of the bed, her thoughts dissolving into the quiet rhythm of night. And as she drifted into sleep, it felt as though the entire hollow exhaled with her, a shared peace, a shared dream, held within the embrace of the season. Spring came to Cedar Hollow like a soft exhale. The snow melted into the earth, feeding the creek until it sang again with life, clear and full, tumbling over smooth stones that gleamed beneath the returning sun. The air was warmer now, touched with the scent of rain and growing things. The trees unfurled new leaves, 1,000 tiny green flames, and wildflowers began to bloom at the edges of the path that led from Eleanor's cottage to the woods. Every morning, she opened her window to the sound of birdsong, a melody that had been silent through the long months of snow. The air was cool and damp, and sunlight spilled in slanted beams across the wooden floor, painting it gold. She began her days slowly, with tea and her journal, her handwriting growing looser and more graceful as the weeks passed. There was something healing about the rhythm of the place, the steady unfolding of each day, the way the seasons turned without asking for anything but attention. She often found herself at the creek now, sitting on a flat stone that jutted from the bank, her skirts brushing the water. The light reflected there in ripples like liquid glass. She would dip her fingers into the stream and watch the circles widen, feeling the coolness and clarity of it. It reminded her of the dream, the one she'd had in the deepest part of winter, of walking beside the glowing current. Sometimes she thought about the figure who had walked with her in that dream, the one who had felt both unknown and familiar. She never tried to name them. It seemed better that way, as though they were not a person at all, but a feeling. A gentle reminder that even in solitude, we are not truly alone. One afternoon, while walking back from the village, Eleanor noticed something curious. The lantern in the clearing, the one that had guided her through the snow, was no longer hanging where it had always been. For a moment she froze, her heart catching. Then, as she stepped closer, she saw that the tree branch above the clearing had bent lower with new growth, and the lantern had been gently lowered to the forest floor. It still glowed faintly, though it was daylight. The light was softer now, more golden than fire, more memory than flame. She knelt beside it, touching the cool glass. Inside, the wick burned without smoke. She could see her reflection in the glow, her face calm, her eyes no longer shadowed by grief or uncertainty. She whispered, "You don't have to keep watch anymore." And somehow, she felt it understood. The glow pulsed once, tenderly, and then steadied again. She stayed there for a long time, until the evening wind began to move through the trees. When she finally rose to leave, the air carried a hush of contentment, as though the forest itself approved. That night, she dreamed again. She stood in the clearing, the lantern light weaving around her like a shawl. The voice she'd felt but never heard spoke softly then, not in words but in a kind of knowing. It said, "You've come home to yourself." When Eleanor woke, she found her cheeks wet with tears, but she was smiling. The days that followed were gentle ones. The people of Cedar Hollow began planting their gardens. Children played by the creek, and the sky filled with migrating birds returning north. Eleanor often joined Mrs. Claiborne for morning walks, or Mr. Hollis for quiet afternoons at the bookstore, sorting through new arrivals and sharing tea in cracked china cups. She had become part of the place, not a guest anymore, but a thread in the small, beautiful pattern of its life. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, she sat outside her cottage with her journal open on her lap. The air was filled with the hum of crickets and the rustle of leaves. She began to write. The world is full of small miracles. They hide in the spaces between silence and sound, between what is lost and what remains. I think peace comes when we stop searching for it, when we finally sit still long enough to feel the warmth that has been waiting beside us all along. She paused, smiled softly, and closed the book. As twilight deepened, the first fireflies began to appear. They floated above the grass like drifting embers, their glow reflected in the creek. She leaned back in her chair, watching them, her breathing slow and easy. The moon rose, a pale silver coin above the trees, and its light fell across the water, catching the soft ripples like silk. Somewhere far off, an owl called once, then again. The world felt infinite and close all at once. And as Eleanor sat there beneath the endless, quiet sky, she thought of all the nights that had come before. The nights of uncertainty, of loneliness, of searching, and how they had all led her here, to this stillness, to Cedar Hollow, to the simple grace of being alive and unhurried. The lantern's glow faded gently from her dreams after that, but its warmth never left her. Some evenings, when the moonlight shimmered on the creek just right, she could almost see it reflected there, a single, steady flame beneath the surface, keeping its quiet vigil. As the night deepened, the sounds of the forest slowed into calm. The wind softened, the stars hung steady, and the world exhaled. Eleanor closed her eyes, her head resting against the chair, the rhythm of the creek whispering her into sleep. And in that stillness, that perfect hush between one breath and the next, Cedar Hollow itself seemed to sigh, as if settling into its own gentle dream. Summer arrived in Cedar Hollow like a tender song, slow and golden, stretching its warmth over the hills and valleys until every blade of grass shimmered beneath the sun. The scent of honeysuckle drifted through the air, and the willows that lined the creek swayed lazily in the soft wind. Days grew longer, and twilight took its time before giving way to night. The town seemed to breathe easier, as though each person had learned to live more softly, more fully, with the rhythm of the land. Eleanor had never known a summer quite like this one. The light that spilled through her cottage windows in the mornings seemed gentler, glowing in shades of amber and gold. The creek murmured just beyond the garden fence, its voice familiar now, a lullaby she had come to depend on. She spent her mornings tending to her small herb garden, her hands brushing through lavender and mint. By midday, she would often walk into the village, where laughter spilled from open shop doors and children chased one another barefoot along the cobblestone streets. One of her favorite places to visit was the Riverside Bakery. Its doorbell jingled softly whenever she entered, and the smell of cinnamon and fresh bread greeted her like an old friend. The baker, a round, cheerful man named Tom, always saved her the last raspberry tart. They talked for a while about the weather, about how fast the seasons seemed to be passing, and then she'd sit outside beneath the awning with her tart and tea, watching the river glitter just beyond the hill. As evening fell each day, Cedar Hollow transformed. The light mellowed into a honeyed hue, and the air turned cooler. Villagers would gather near the water, sitting on blankets or leaning against the willow trunks, sharing quiet conversations as fireflies began to flicker around them. Eleanor loved these moments most, when everything slowed, when the world seemed to hum with peace. One night, word spread through the village that the Lantern Festival would soon return, a celebration that marked the heart of summer. It was said that the tradition dated back centuries, when the earliest settlers had floated lanterns down the creek to honor the spirits of loved ones and the blessings of the year. The idea was to light a lantern, whisper a wish into its flame, and send it drifting down the water to carry that wish into the unknown. Eleanor listened as Mrs. Claiborne explained the tradition to her one warm afternoon. The old woman's eyes sparkled as she spoke. "It's more than a festival," she said softly. "It's a promise, a reminder that no wish is ever too small to matter." That night, Eleanor sat by her window, watching the moon rise above the trees. The thought of the lanterns lingered in her mind, glowing softly, floating downstream like little fragments of hope. She wondered what she would wish for if she made one. Peace. She had found that here. Love? In her quiet way. She felt surrounded by it already, not in grand declarations, but in the kindness of the people who had welcomed her, in the gentle comfort of the town that had healed her. Still, something deep within her stirred. Not a longing, exactly, but a curiosity, a whisper of what might come next. Perhaps, she thought, her wish could be for that, to remain open to whatever life wanted to bring her in its own time. When the night of the festival came, Cedar Hollow glowed. Lanterns of every color hung from trees and shop fronts, their lights swaying in the warm breeze. The air was filled with music, soft guitar notes, laughter, the hum of distant conversation. Children carried paper lanterns shaped like stars and moons, their faces bright with wonder. Eleanor stood near the riverbank with a lantern of her own, a simple one, its sides made of pale paper and its base painted with the image of the creek. She lit the candle within it carefully, shielding the flame with her hand. The reflection shimmered across the water, golden and still. Around her, others began to set their lanterns afloat. The river glowed with dozens of drifting lights, each one moving slowly, steadily downstream, like stars carried by the current. When it was her turn, Eleanor knelt by the edge of the river. The grass was cool beneath her fingers. She closed her eyes, feeling the summer air move gently through her hair, and whispered into the flame, "Thank you for bringing me here, for teaching me to listen again." She let go, and the lantern drifted forward, bobbing once before settling into the flow. It glided away, joining the others, a quiet, golden spark among many. As she watched, she felt a weight lift from her chest, not sadness but release. The water carried her wish onward, and she understood then that peace was not something to hold on to. It was something to trust, something that came when you stopped asking it to stay. Later that night, when the crowd had thinned and the music softened to silence, Eleanor lingered by the river. The moon hung high above the water, its reflection weaving through the floating lanterns. The breeze was warm and gentle, and somewhere nearby, a night bird sang. She sat on the grass, her eyes heavy but her heart wide open. The sound of the creek blended with the rustling of leaves and the fading laughter from the village square. Slowly, she lay back and looked at the stars. They glittered softly, scattered across the sky like the lanterns upon the river, endless and bright. Her thoughts drifted, her breathing slowed, and the edges of the world began to blur. She thought about her first night in Cedar Hollow, how she'd arrived with a suitcase full of uncertainty, searching for something she couldn't yet name, and how little by little this quiet place had given her what she needed, not through answers, but through peace. The last thing she saw before her eyes closed was the reflection of her lantern far down the creek, glowing faintly as it disappeared around a bend. That night, Cedar Hollow slept beneath a sky full of stars, the creek singing softly as it carried the village's dreams downstream. And in one small cottage by the water, Eleanor dreamed of warmth, of candlelight, of laughter, of everything that made the world gentle again. The weeks after the Lantern Festival passed with a sweetness that felt suspended in time. The air grew cooler by the slightest degree, a whisper that autumn was near, yet summer still clung lovingly to the valley. Cedar Hollow was bathed in long, amber evenings that seemed to last forever. The lights softened around everything, the cobblestones, the willow branches, the whitewashed fences along the creek, as if the town itself was glowing from within. Eleanor had fallen into a rhythm so gentle that the days often blurred together. Each morning began with the scent of warm bread from the bakery drifting through her window. She'd make herself tea, sometimes sit on the porch steps with her shawl around her shoulders, and watch the mist rise off the creek like breath from a sleeping world. Birds would sing from the maple trees, and every so often, a deer would wander past the edge of her garden, pausing to look at her with quiet curiosity before disappearing into the brush. When the mornings gave way to afternoon, Eleanor often walked into the village carrying a small woven basket. She would stop by the flower stall to buy a few sprigs of fresh daisies, or visit the bookshop tucked behind the old church. The shop was owned by a man named Samuel, whose gray beard and kind eyes made him look as if he belonged in one of the stories he sold. His shop always smelled of parchment and cedarwood, and a black cat named Fig would curl around Eleanor's ankles as she browsed. Sometimes she'd stay for hours, sitting by the window seat with a cup of coffee Samuel brewed in a copper pot, flipping through books of poetry and travel. She rarely bought any. Samuel insisted she borrow them instead, saying that stories belonged to everyone who needed them. One afternoon, as she was returning home along the creek path, she heard laughter drifting from the water's edge. A group of children were skipping stones, their giggles echoing through the air. Eleanor paused to watch, smiling as the stones skipped across the surface. 1, 2, 3, then plop. The moment felt so pure, so untouched, that she wished she could capture it somehow. As evening came, she returned to her cottage, where she would light a small lantern and place it by the window. The glow reflected gently on the creek, mingling with the moonlight. On some nights, a neighbor or two would stop by, Mrs. Claiborne bringing warm pie, or Tom from the bakery sharing stories about the old days. They would sit near the fire, sipping tea or cocoa, letting conversation wander like the wind outside. But Eleanor's favorite nights were the quiet ones, when she sat alone by the fire, listening to the wood crackle and the creek murmur beyond the walls. It was in those moments that she felt the world slow to a stillness, so complete it felt sacred. One night, rain began to fall, softly at first, like a whisper, then steady and rhythmic. The drops pattered against the roof and ran down the windows in silver threads. Eleanor drew a blanket around her shoulders and watched the rain shimmer under the lantern light. The scent of wet earth and pine filled the air, as she thought of how she used to dread storms back in the city. The way thunder would echo between buildings, cold and sharp. Here, rain felt like an old friend. It had a gentleness to it, a music that made her heart ache in the best way. She listened to it for hours, her eyelids growing heavy until sleep claimed her right there in her chair, the sound of rain cradling her like a lullaby. Days passed, and the season began to shift. The first hints of autumn touched the trees, painting their edges in gold and crimson. The wind turned crisp, and the scent of wood smoke returned to the air. Cedar Hollow became even more beautiful, as if it was exhaling one last burst of color before winter's hush. The village prepared for the harvest market, one of its most beloved traditions. Stalls lined the square, filled with apples, pumpkins, jars of honey, and hand-knit scarves. The bakery displayed pies of every flavor: spiced pear, maple pecan, cinnamon apple. Eleanor helped Mrs. Claiborne weave garlands of dried herbs to decorate the stands. She laughed as they worked, her hands covered in lavender dust, her cheeks flushed with warmth. When the market opened, lanterns were strung across the streets, their light flickering against the amber leaves. Musicians played near the fountain, and families wandered hand in hand, their laughter mingling with the soft hum of the violin. Eleanor walked among them, feeling a part of something larger than herself. For the first time in many years, she wasn't an observer passing through. She was home. As twilight deepened, the sound of music drifted down toward the creek. The entire town seemed to glow under the light of the harvest moon. Eleanor wandered away from the crowd, following the path to her favorite willow tree. The leaves shimmered under the moonlight, and the water reflected every golden hue of the lanterns from the village. She sat down beneath the tree, the cool grass brushing her fingertips, and closed her eyes. The night felt alive, filled with the smell of cinnamon and pine, the faint sound of laughter from far away, and the gentle murmur of the creek. It struck her then how much she had changed since she arrived at Cedar Hollow. The woman who once sought solitude had found belonging. The one who once feared the quiet now cherished it. The stillness that used to feel empty now felt full of voices, memories, and warmth. She opened her eyes to see a single leaf drifting down the current, spinning softly as it went. Somewhere downstream, she imagined her lantern from the summer still glowing faintly, its light carried forward by the same current that now held this leaf. She smiled, realizing that the creek, the heart of Cedar Hollow, had always been carrying her too, in its quiet, steady way. The stars were beginning to appear when she rose and walked back toward the village. The sound of a fiddle carried through the cool air, and the lanterns flickered in every window she passed. She paused by her own cottage where the firelight danced behind the curtains and stood there for a moment, listening. The creek whispered beside her. The wind rustled through the trees. Somewhere nearby, an owl called softly into the night. And in that simple symphony of sound, she heard what she had always been searching for: peace. She went inside, lit a single candle, and placed it by the window. Its glow joined the reflection of the moon upon the water, merging into one gentle shimmer. Then she sat by the fire, a book in her lap, her breath slow and steady, the warmth of the flames painting her cheeks in gold. As the night deepened, she felt her eyes grow heavy. Outside, the world moved softly. The creek sang, the trees sighed, and the stars kept silent watch. When sleep came, it was like slipping into the current, effortless, serene, endless. The night deepened, and a quiet hush fell over Cedar Hollow. The market lights faded one by one, until only the softest glow remained over the square. The last laughter drifted into the air like wisps of smoke, and the sound of footsteps on cobblestone grew distant, replaced by the gentle murmur of the creek winding through the village. The wind had turned cool and tender, brushing against the leaves, carrying with it the scent of apple cider and wood smoke. Eleanor sat by her window, gazing out toward the water. A faint mist had risen from the creek, curling like pale ribbons through the trees. The lantern she had left on the porch flickered, casting long, dreamy shadows across the walls. In that half-light, everything seemed softer. The corners of the room blurred, and the world beyond the window shimmered faintly, as if caught between waking and sleep. She could hear the rhythmic chirping of crickets, the distant call of a night bird, and the soft tap of rain beginning again, a light, steady drizzle that kissed the ground with a quiet patter. It wasn't the kind of rain that came to wash things away. It was the kind that lingered, the kind that made the world feel safe, wrapped in its own heartbeat. Eleanor poured herself a cup of tea from the kettle that had been simmering by the fire. The scent of chamomile filled the air, mingling with the faint aroma of pine from the logs. She sat down in her favorite chair, the one near the hearth, and tucked the blanket closer around her shoulders. The warmth of the fire seemed to melt the chill from her fingers, and she could feel her whole body begin to relax. Outside, the rain grew steadier. It fell across the creek, dimpling its glassy surface, the drops catching the light of her lantern in tiny bursts. The sound was hypnotic, a steady rhythm that lulled her into a state of quiet reverie. The flames danced lazily, each flicker reflecting off her teacup like the pulse of a dream. As she stared into the fire, her thoughts began to drift, slowly at first, then with more freedom, as though the rain itself were washing her memories clean. She thought of the first day she'd arrived at Cedar Hollow, how uncertain she'd felt, how small her steps had been on the cobbled path. She remembered the faces she'd met, warm, open, patient, and the way they had quietly welcomed her without question. She had found something here that she hadn't known she was missing. Not just peace, but connection, belonging, the gentle assurance that the world still had soft places left in it, corners where time moved slower, and people still looked for beauty in ordinary things. Her gaze drifted toward the window again. The rain had turned into a fine mist, and the moon appeared faintly behind a veil of clouds. The light from it shimmered across the water, pale and silver. It seemed to reach right up to her window, like an invitation. She rose slowly, set her cup down, and stepped out onto the porch. The night air was cool against her skin, carrying the scent of wet earth and moss. The lantern beside her glowed softly, its glass glistening with tiny droplets. Across the creek, the trees stood tall and still, their leaves glimmering faintly under the moonlight. The world felt suspended, the kind of stillness that exists only in the late hours of night, when even time seems to hold its breath. Eleanor stepped down from the porch and walked barefoot toward the creek. The grass was damp beneath her feet, cool and soft, and each step felt like a quiet promise, the earth itself welcoming her. The sound of water filled her ears, steady and rhythmic, like the world's own heartbeat. When she reached the water's edge, she knelt down and trailed her fingers through the current. It was cold, but alive, moving endlessly, whispering its secrets to the stones below. She closed her eyes and listened. In the hush between raindrops, she could almost hear something, faint and distant, yet clear. It wasn't a voice exactly, but a feeling, a murmur of warmth, a hum of belonging, as though the creek was speaking in a language older than words. She smiled softly, realizing what it was, the sound of life itself, the quiet rhythm of everything connected. She stayed there for a long time, until her breathing matched the water's flow, until her thoughts slowed to the same gentle pace. The rain had stopped, leaving the night washed clean. The sky had opened again, and the stars gleamed above, scattered across the darkness like seeds of light. Eleanor looked up at them, her reflection shimmering faintly in the creek below. The stars seemed closer here, not distant and unreachable, but tender and watching, like old friends keeping vigil. As she stood, the lantern on the porch flickered once more, casting a soft glow across the grass. She walked back toward it, each step lighter than the one before, until she reached the doorway. The fire inside had dimmed to a slow, golden glow. She slipped inside and closed the door gently behind her. The air was warm, wrapping around her like an embrace. She hung her shawl on its hook and paused to look around. The shelves lined with books, the vase of wildflowers by the window, the kettle still humming faintly on the hearth. Every detail felt perfect in its simplicity. She sat once more by the fire, letting its light fill her gaze. The logs cracked softly, sparks drifting upward like tiny fireflies. She rested her head against the armrest, her eyes growing heavier with each breath. Outside, the creek sang softly, a lullaby written in the language of ripples and moonlight. The warmth of the fire, the hush of the night, the faint scent of rain. They blended together into something so serene that she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. Her body sank deeper into the chair, her breath slowing, her mind loosening its grip on the waking world. As sleep approached, she thought of how far she had come. Not in miles, but in peace. The world beyond Cedar Hollow could rush and roar all it wanted. Here, time would always move with the rhythm of the rain, the murmur of the creek, and the quiet beating of her heart. Her last thought before drifting away was simple and full. A silent thank you to the place that had taught her stillness, to the fire that had kept her warm, and to the stars that had watched her find her way home. The firelight shimmered against the walls, casting long shadows that moved like the slow breath of the night. The rain outside had softened to a fine mist, and the sound of droplets slipping from the eaves into the creek formed a delicate rhythm, steady, patient, timeless. Eleanor half opened her eyes, her head resting against the back of her chair, the warmth of the fire touching her cheeks. Her body had grown heavy, her limbs loose, as if she were sinking into the soft heart of the world. The cottage around her felt alive in its stillness. The quiet ticking of the clock on the mantel, the faint hiss of embers shifting in the hearth, the sigh of wind brushing the edges of the window panes. Everything blended together in a kind of harmony that wasn't meant to be noticed, only felt. Cedar Hollow had a way of making even silence feel like music. Outside, the mist was curling low along the ground, trailing like thin silver ribbons between the trees. The creek glowed faintly in the moonlight, each ripple scattering light across its surface. Beyond it, the hills stretched into soft darkness, and the scent of cedar and damp earth rose with the air. Somewhere, a barn owl called, a single drawn-out note that echoed softly through the valley before fading into the sound of the water. Eleanor's eyes fluttered open, then closed again. The fire was dimming, but she didn't mind. She let her thoughts wander, light as smoke, until they began to merge with the world outside. The line between the room and the night seemed to dissolve, until she could almost feel herself sitting by the creek again, watching the moon float across the water. In her mind, she could see it clearly, the willows swaying in the breeze, the soft glow of lanterns from distant cottages, their reflections rippling like candlelight across the current. The air smelled faintly of rain and pine, of something sweet and green. Her heart beat slower, in rhythm with the flow of the water, and she felt as though the world was breathing along with her. Then came the faintest whisper, not of words, but of memory. The sound of laughter from the festival weeks ago, the rustle of pages from Samuel's bookshop, the creak of the wooden bridge that crossed the creek. It was as if Cedar Hollow itself was speaking to her, reminding her gently that everything here, every lantern, every leaf, every breath of wind, was part of something connected. The fire popped softly, and a spark drifted up into the air before fading into nothing. Eleanor smiled without opening her eyes. In that moment, she wasn't just resting in her chair. She was part of the world around her, a small piece of something vast and peaceful. Her breathing deepened. The warmth of the fire spread across her body, down to her fingertips. The crackle of the wood blended with the soft hum of the creek outside, until the two sounds became one continuous melody, a lullaby older than words. If one could see through the window, they might have thought she was dreaming with her eyes open. The light on her face shifted slowly, flickering from gold to amber to shadow. Her hair caught the firelight, and her lips moved slightly, as though whispering to the night. Outside, the mist began to thin. The clouds parted, revealing a sky scattered with stars so clear and bright they looked close enough to touch. The moon hung high above the hills, washing the valley in silver light. Every drop of water on every blade of grass sparkled faintly. The world glowed, not with brilliance, but with quiet beauty, the kind that makes you forget time. The creek's current carried small leaves and petals downstream, turning them gently as they went. Lanterns that had drifted from the village earlier in the evening now floated by Eleanor's cottage, their golden light flickering on the dark water like tiny, wandering souls. In the soft glow of those lights, the reflection of her cottage shimmered, the warm window, the faint shadow of a woman sitting peacefully within. Time slipped. Minutes became moments. Moments became something softer, something without measure. Eleanor's breaths grew slower, deeper. The rhythm of the night folded around her like a blanket. Her thoughts drifted further now, toward dreams that felt not separate from life, but an extension of it. She imagined herself walking through the hollow at dawn, when the mist clings to the grass and the air tastes new. The sun hadn't yet risen, but the light was changing, that gentle prelude before morning truly wakes. She could hear the soft rustle of the creek, the quiet flutter of wings, the sigh of wind through the cedars. In her dream, she followed the sound of the water until she came to a clearing she hadn't seen before. There, at the edge of the creek, was an old wooden bench. Dew glistened on it like tiny jewels. She sat down, feeling the wood cool beneath her palms. The air was filled with that golden stillness that only exists before daybreak, when everything is waiting, listening, poised between night and morning. She looked into the water, and for a moment, it seemed to reflect not her face, but scenes from her life. The cottage, the festival, the friends she had made, even the fire still burning quietly inside her home. It was as if the creek held her story within it, carrying it onward through every turn and ripple. A warmth spread through her chest, gentle and full. She smiled and closed her eyes, the sound of the water cradling her. The sun began to rise then, spilling pale light over the hills, painting the mist in gold. The world seemed to hold its breath, and then, softly, exhaled. The dream folded into stillness. Back in her chair, Eleanor's face was calm, her breathing steady. The last of the fire's glow painted her features in the color of early dawn. Outside, Cedar Hollow began to wake, quietly, tenderly. The first bird sang. The creek continued its endless song, and the mist rose in silvery waves before fading into the light. And in that peaceful hour, as day returned to the valley, Eleanor slept on, safe, warm, and utterly at peace, wrapped in the breath of the world she had come to love by the fireside at Willow Creek. The morning light crept through the thin curtains of the cottage, gentle and golden, the way sunlight filters through honey. It touched the wooden floorboards, glimmered across the edges of Eleanor's quilt, and found its way to her face, soft, warm, and tranquil. The fireplace had gone quiet sometime before dawn, but the faintest trail of warmth still lingered in the air, like an old melody that refused to fade. Outside, the world was stirring in delicate rhythms. The breeze carried the scent of wet cedar and distant rain. The creek, now silver blue in the morning light, murmured softly as if whispering secrets to the stones beneath its surface. A heron stood on one leg near the bend, its reflection shimmering on the rippling water. Above, clouds drifted lazily, their edges glowing like feathers dipped in sunlight. Eleanor stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering open, though she didn't move. She wasn't quite awake, not in the way the world demanded people to be awake. Her thoughts were slow, unfurling like tendrils of smoke rising from a candle. She could still feel the weight of her dream. The soft bench by the river, the golden mist, the reflection that had seemed alive. It was as though she had crossed a threshold in her sleep from one world to another, and the line between them had yet to harden again. She turned her head slightly toward the window. The mist had rolled back toward the woods, clinging to the trees in slow, drifting ribbons. A few golden leaves tumbled from the high branches, spiraling down to rest on the grass below. Every detail outside seemed heightened in the morning calm. The way the light kissed the surface of the water, the way the air shimmered faintly above the fields, the way everything seemed to breathe in time with the creek's gentle current. A small knock echoed at the door, light, careful, like someone testing whether the sound itself might disturb the peace. Eleanor smiled faintly. She knew that knock. It was Samuel, the old bookshop owner who often walked the valley at dawn with a basket of bread and fresh parchment for writing. She didn't rise immediately. She let the warmth of the bed hold her for another minute, listening to the creek, the whisper of wind through the trees, the way the world spoke in soft, wordless tones. When she finally did stand, Her feet met the wooden floor with a sigh. The boards creaked, the way they always did, a familiar kind of music. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and crossed to the door. When she opened it, the morning air brushed against her face, cool, alive, filled with the scent of cedar and fresh earth. Samuel stood there, smiling, his white hair touched by dew. "Morning, Eleanor," he said in that low, steady tone that always made his words sound older than time itself. "The valley's singing today." She laughed softly. It always does if you're quiet enough to listen. He handed her the basket, the warm bread inside wrapped in linen. "I brought this down from the mill," he said, "and a few of those books I found from the old estate. Thought they might suit you." Eleanor thanked him, her eyes shining with the quiet gratitude that didn't need to be spoken. She took the basket inside, setting it on the table beside the hearth. The room smelled of morning now, bread, with smoke, and the faint sweetness of rain drifting in through the open door. Samuel lingered on the porch, looking toward the creek. "The mist was thick earlier," he said. "You could hardly see the water. Looked like the whole world was asleep." "Maybe it was," Eleanor replied. "Maybe it still is a little." He chuckled, to sound low and kind. "Well, if it is, I hope it dreams as gently as this place does." She nodded. There was truth in that. Cedar Hollow felt like a place that dreamed, not in bursts of color or motion, but in slow, quiet breaths that matched the rhythm of the world itself. After Samuel left, Eleanor spent the morning in small, comforting motions. She sliced the bread, poured herself tea, and opened the windows to let the scent of the creek drift through the room. Sunlight fell in soft beams across the table, landing on the spine of one of the books Samuel had brought. She reached for it, an old collection of poems, the kind with worn pages and faintly golden edges. The words inside spoke of rivers and dawn and the hush that follows rain. It felt as though the book had been written just for this place, for this moment. The hours passed unnoticed. The light changed slowly, gliding from pale morning gold to the soft amber of afternoon. Outside, the valley hummed with life. Birds tracing lazy arcs in the sky, bees drifting among the wildflowers that grew near the fence, the sound of the creek never ceasing. Eleanor stepped outside and wandered down to the water's edge. She dipped her hand into the current. It was cool, clear, alive. The ripples danced around her fingers, carrying tiny reflections of sky and leaf. She watched them drift away, her thoughts carried with them. As evening approached, the world softened again. The sky deepened to violet, streaked with rose and silver. The air grew still, touched by the faint smell of wood smoke from distant chimneys. She lit the lantern by her window, and its glow spilled gently onto the path leading to the creek. The same heron returned, gliding low across the water, its wings moving in slow, graceful arcs. It landed on the far bank, standing silent in the fading light. The first stars appeared overhead, fragile and small, like whispers stitched into the sky. Eleanor returned to her chair by the fire, though she didn't light it yet. She didn't need to. The night itself seemed to glow. She opened the book again, her voice barely above a whisper as she read a few lines aloud. The sound mingled with the song of crickets outside, the quiet sigh of the water, and the faint rustle of trees. Time slipped, unnoticed. She felt the pull of sleep again, not as an interruption, but as a continuation of the peace that surrounded her. Her breathing slowed, her body sinking into stillness. The cottage, the creek, the valley, they all breathed together in a single rhythm, soft and endless. The fire flickered faintly to life, as if sparked by her dream. The night deepened, and the mist began to rise once more, wrapping the hollow in its silvery arms. Somewhere beyond the hills, an owl called again. The same low, haunting note, steady and calm. The stars brightened above the valley, mirrored in the slow-moving water. And there, by the fireside at Willow Creek, Eleanor drifted once more, into dreams where the world was soft, the air was gentle, and every sound was a lullaby.